we document, that we continue the research, and that we live the dream, because for many of them it was a dream. I want to start by looking at how this movement began. Not in the 50s or in the 40s. I want to take us back to slavery, and a time when not only women, because although we're talking about this movement, we have to remember that men in the country didn't vote until 1959. So although the women were fighting to vote, it was also something very new for the men as well, particularly for black men, men who did not have property. And property was the means that allowed you to vote. You had to have property, and for many, you had property in many different islands, and you could vote wherever you had property. So for a poor black man who had no property, he could never vote until 1959. But there are two instances that I'd like to mention. Two women who we want to continue to do the research on women throughout history. And we don't want to begin as we in our country have now kind of established that our history began in the 60s and in the 70s. We know that there are many other stories that need to be told, many other stories that need to be documented. Two women, on Monday in the House of Assembly, the Honorable Perry Christie mentioned poor Black Kate. And those of us who've been doing research on slavery know of poor Black Kate. But her story is one of cruelty. She was eventually killed by her owners. Well, she died as a result of the cruelty and the punishment. And her story was used by the Anti-Slave Society to publicize what was happening in the country. And I always say, when we find documented cases in slavery, we know that the persons must have been significant, because you did not write about slaves. You didn't know their names. The other story is that of Mary Prince. And these are people who were in our country, and they fought against the situations that they were in. Mary Prince eventually made it to the UK, was able to literally leave her masters who refused to give her freedom. And her story was also written about in these anti-slave booklets that were distributed throughout the region and the world. And my point is that these were women who fought against an establishment because they were women. They had no rights. They had no thought of ever being accepted, even of being free. So the first step was to become free. And then we have a period when we literally know very little about what women did in our country, basically the post-emancipation period up until about the turn of the century. And then we begin to see organized movements. And so we come to a period that is just prior to the period that the documentary is focusing on. And I'd like to just briefly go over some of the immediate steps that led to the women's right to vote in 1962. I started to do this research about 25 years ago. I was shocked when I realized how long ago it was. And at the time, I was working at the Department of Archives, and we wanted to look at topics that had not been researched. There is so much that we need to do. Everyone in here needs to decide on a topic, do some research, and write. We all need to write, do a documentary. You can do it, because we are not producing. You go to somebody comes to visit the country and they say, where is your bookstore? And you go in the bookstore and there's about 10 books that you can point to that you would recommend. We should not be in that situation. 25 years removed, just from 87, and I'm saying this, and we should have done this long ago. So I want to encourage you to do research and to write. The movement, as I said, in 1952, really, this movement, this women's movement kind of took root. And as was mentioned in the short clip, the lodges were behind the movement initially. The women organized themselves in lodges. Lodges were a place where they learned parliamentary procedure, they learned how to work in groups, they learned how to organize themselves, and so the lodges were the base from which these women started the movement. In particular, it was the Order of the Improved, Benevolent, and Protective Order of the Elks Lodge. And that's where Mary Ingram, Mabel Walker, Effie Archer, Mamie Aswood, and some of you know these names. And I understand that the initial group collected 430 other names. I'm trying to find out who those ladies were. We need to know. Some of your grandmothers, I'm trying to find the list. Who were those 438 others that signed that initial petition in 1952 and caused those women to believe that we have others who want to do what we want to do? And that's what really sparked it. We have others who were willing to stand out here with us and make a move in the direction that we want to go. And of course, there was a lot that was happening in the world. The United Nations had just, in 1952 as well, a convention on the political rights of women had been adopted by the General Assembly, and this was encouraging. And then I found a very interesting newspaper letter written by Sylvia Larimore in 1954. And she was asking the women, what are we waiting on? How long will we sit and wait for somebody else to come along and do it? And Sir Etienne responded to her letter and said to her, oh, this is good, we support it, but you have to wait a little longer. So she didn't take it very well. She wrote him back. She wrote back. They had a little conversation in the paper. And she said, no, we need to move now. So she was also one of those ladies who was among the group that was petitioning and collecting the signatures. And I gather from some of the women that I've spoken to, these women began to have meetings in churches. They were having meetings in schools, and then they began, of course, to some of them, as was mentioned, were active in the political party, the PLP, and I think there were also some very gray areas there. But women came out because they knew that they needed to be among the numbers that was working in this direction. Many of the women that I've spoken to said they came out, but they were afraid. They were afraid that they would lose their jobs. Some of them, as we mentioned, they were in homes where husbands dominated the situation. They were not employed outside of the homes, and so they were dependent on their husbands and what they did at home. But they came out, they talked about how they cooked meals so that they could raise money to help support the movement. So there was an active movement that was developing in the country. By 1957, the suffrage movement was better organized after the general election, and the PLP party came out and openly supported the movement to give women the right to vote. Sir Randall Fox, he was a member of the PLP, and he openly supported the movement, and he identified some of the challenges that he saw to the movement. One, he said, was the lack of education and training and guidance in the schools that women needed. The labor situation where many women were not employed, were working in the homes, and therefore the difference in the male-female ratio in terms of who was employed, and the lack of childcare facilities that would allow women to be able to go out and work. And I know that I need to stop already. You need to do it? Okay, I'm just on a roll here.
That's the signal. Then I pick up the mic.
Okay. But these were very important concerns. By 1958, Doris Johnson had come on the scene, and she was a very well-educated, as was mentioned, militant. She had been to school in the U.S., and she became a natural leader for the movement. The ladies rallied around her, and she was able to steer the activities. By the late 1958, they were constantly petitioning the House of Assembly, and by 58, they had presented a second petition and gotten more than 2,000 signatures behind their effort. Doris Johnson in 1959 in January made her, I call it her keynote speech. She spoke to the House of Assembly. They would not allow her to speak in the House. She had to speak in the magistrate's court. And as a result of that, she lost her scholarship. Okay? Because she was able to step out there, and she lost her scholarship. You could imagine what that did to her, but she was determined. And she stayed with the movement. By the late 1950s, of course, men got the right to vote, and they were behind, I would say the men were behind the movement, but as Sylvia Larimore said, we needed to do it for ourselves. If we didn't do it, it wasn't going to happen.
Could be, could be.
Ultimately,
we have questions and answers.
Yes. Ultimately, in 61, in 1961, January, the first reading of the bill to give women the right to vote happened, and in February it was passed. Women voted for the first time in November of 62. And I just want to give a statistic. When the registration started initially in July, 2,000 women registered. By September, over 13,000 women had registered to vote. Wow. And of the total population of registered voters, 80% of them were women. So they were interested. In addition, although Mrs. Darling was the first to register, a lady named Eileen Mackey was the first to vote. And she voted in the city constituency. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.